Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to a complete and updated Yae Miko guide. This guide is updated for Yae Miko's rerun in patch 3.2, and since Yae Miko's last banner, since my last Yae Miko guide, she has gotten much better indirectly through the release of the Dendro element, which she honestly has some really good synergy with. I explained that in my last video, but in today's video, I'm going to be focusing on everything you need to know about how to build and play Yae Miko efficiently, covering her best playstyles, weapons, artifacts, teams, and just everything you need to know about this character. Obviously, since I am covering every playstyle, it goes without saying that I will be covering playing her both with and without Dendro, and then also on or off field, as there are quite a few different ways to play and build this character, which I will explain in as much detail as possible without taking too much time. Because of that, I do want to get right into it, but before we do, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and with that being said, let's get into it. Alright, so starting things off, what does Yae Miko actually do? What do her talents and abilities do? Well, first of all, her elemental skill is this sort of electro shrine that she can place after dashing in a direction. When you use it, you will dash in whichever direction you're facing, and place this Sakura shrine behind you that will periodically hit enemies with a good amount of electro damage that is for the most part single target. What you need to know about this ability though is that you can place it 3 times. You can have up to 3 of these out at a time, and you do have 3 charges of it, 3 charges of your elemental skill, which means you're typically just going to use your skill 3 times, and then have 3 pillars out that will deal increasing amounts of electro damage based on how many you have. In fact, regardless of how many you have out, you're only going to be dealing 1 instance of electro damage, but this 1 instance will do more based on how many pillars you have out, and the maximum is 3 at Constellation 0. But if you have your second constellation, you can unlock this level 4 scaling here, whereas if not, it's just this level 3 damage, which is still really good. Just do note that level 4 is locked behind your second constellation if you do choose to get that. If that wasn't enough, it's also very important to have 3 skills out at all times because of your elemental burst, which is a big strike of AoE electro damage, which does actually have a good area of effect and pretty high scaling, so it is a good ability. However, the total damage it deals does scale on how many pillars are out on the field, as the skill damage that it deals is this 1 primary instance of damage, but then after that it will do another thunderbolt for every pillar you have out. So if you have 3 out, it'll do 1 hit at the start and then 3 additional hits, whereas if you have no pillars, it'll just do that 1 hit and then nothing else. So obviously it is very important to make sure you have all 3 charges of your skill out on the field at the same time throughout your entire rotation, but especially when you're using your burst. Your burst has a long cooldown of 22 seconds and a big energy cost of 90, but it is a really good ability, so it's not something you want to neglect. But because of this high cost, you're either going to use it every rotation or every other rotation, depending on how much energy you can get and what team you're playing, but more on that a bit later. Also, another important thing to know is that when you use your burst, in order to deal those additional thunderbolts based on how many skills you have out, how many pillars are out on the field, it will actually consume them. So let's say you use your skill 3 times and then use your burst. Those 3 pillars that were out on the field previously will no longer be there, so you're gonna have to use your skill another 3 times right after. In fact, thanks to your passive talent, this becomes easy because after using your burst, you will gain 1 charge back for every pillar that was destroyed. So in practice, what that means is you use your skill 3 times, then you use your burst, and then you use your skill another 3 times. This does have the downside of requiring a lot more field time on Yae Miko, and during this she is vulnerable, but it is worth it for the high amounts of damage that she does provide you with. Now for her last passive talent, you also gain an additional scaling based on your elemental mastery, 0.15% of damage to your elemental skill for each point of EM that Yae Miko does have. Now while this doesn't make EM strictly better than attack from just a scaling perspective, because the attack scaling is higher and also your burst scales on attack, but not only does this make elemental mastery a more appealing substat and an okay option, but it's even more relevant when it comes to Dendro teams, which are the new ways to play Yae Miko, where she is either in a Quicken or Aggravate team or in a Hyperbloom team, which are reactions where elemental mastery influences how much damage you're dealing, especially for Hyperbloom that scales primarily, if you didn't know, on your elemental mastery and your level. Because of that, this passive talent is another reason why she's good in those teams, because building elemental mastery, while it may not be the only thing you want, can be more appealing and at least a good substat, but more on this in the artifact section that's coming up soon, where I will go into more specifics about how to build her. Lastly, before moving on, I did want to point out the fact that she is a catalyst user, which means that all of her attacks will be infused with electro, which means that while she is typically a powerful off-field support, and I guess we're kind of talking about playstyles now, she can also be used from on-field if you need someone to fill in downtime or to apply more electro, and this is especially true in some of the new reaction teams. For example, while typically her playstyle has been use your skill 3 times, then use your burst when you have it, use your skill again, and then swap out, and that is still her quote-unquote primary playstyle or a very common one, she can also, by virtue of being an electro catalyst, be used on field when you need to apply electro with her attacks. This is especially relevant in number 1 Hyperbloom teams because her skills targeting is kind of inconsistent. Like, it'll hit enemies around you, but it won't consistently proc Hyperbloom. As you can see from the footage on screen, it'll proc Hyperbloom, but it won't proc as much as you want, to where in those teams you'd rather use her on field, as her normal and charge stacks can very easily enable you to consistently proc Hyperbloom. And if you want more information on that and the new Dendro Reaction stuff, I highly suggest you go watch my last Yae Miko video. With that said, she can also be ran in non-Dendro teams like with Raiden or some Electro Charge variations, which we will cover. So do keep that in mind in this video and in the team section, as I will be talking a lot about Yae Miko in Dendro focused teams, but also just in other teams as well, to really cover every type of build and playstyle of Yae Miko. With that said, I don't want to make this section too complicated, but that is kind of how her playstyles work. Either you run her from off field as a good Electro support, or you can even use her on field as your quote unquote DPS or driver to apply as much Electro as possible and do really good reaction damage. Because of that, I believe Yae Miko's a good character who got even better with Dendro, and so she's definitely someone that I recommend to use and build if you have her. Finally, before moving on, for your talent priority, leveling your skill is going to be the most important, followed by your burst, both of which you shouldn't neglect. And then if you use her on field, you can also level her normal attacks. If not, you can ignore them. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about how to specifically build your Yae Miko. Starting things off, let's talk about our artifact sets. While there are many options, I want to start by talking about the 4-piece Gilded Dreams. The 4-piece Gilded Dreams is typically going to be your best in slot artifact set for Yae Miko if you are proccing Dendro based reactions especially. This is therefore going to be for Quicken teams or Aggravate teams, depending on what you want to call them, or for Hyperbloom teams where Elemental Mastery is going to be especially important. For those teams, Gilded Dreams is so good because of the sheer amount of stats that you gain from it. In fact, the 2-piece set will give you 80 Elemental Mastery, and then the 4-piece will give you additional EM or attack percent based on the elemental types of the party members you choose to run with your Yae Miko. Generally speaking, since you gain 50 EM for every non-Electro character and 14% attack for every other Electro character in your party, if you're running Yae with another Electro and 2 characters of different elements, which is pretty standard in many different team comps, you will get a total of 180 Elemental Mastery and 14% attack from the combined 2 and 4-piece, which is really good for Yae Miko. Now, while the 4-piece set effect won't have 100% uptime with Yae because of the way it works, you make up for that by the sheer amount of stats you're gaining, and also by the fact that Elemental Mastery will not only increase your reaction damage, which is very important, but you'll also gain bonus scaling with the passive talent that we talked about earlier that will increase your Yae Miko's elemental skill damage based on her Elemental Mastery. Because of that, this artifact set is really good for her, and typically going to be what I recommend if you are proccing Dendro Reactions as a really good general option. Now, with that said, there are other artifact sets you can go if you either don't have a good gilded set or aren't focused on the new Dendro Reaction teams, as there are many ways to play Yae Miko. Now, those other sets that I want to talk about include the 4-piece Thunder Soother, gives you 35% damage against Electro affected opponents, so you don't want to make sure you're in a team where enemies will stay affected by Electro and you can't have good Thunder Soother uptime, because if that is the case, then this set becomes very powerful and usually the best overall, although do keep in mind it can be difficult to maintain this uptime. Moving on, other good options include mix and matching 2-pieces like 2-piece Thundering Fury for Electro damage bonus, with either 2-piece of an EM set, 2-piece of a attack percent set, or even the 2-piece Noblesse Oblige for some burst damage, or even the 2-piece emblem for energy recharge. All of these 2-pieces mix and match based on your substats can be good and viable options for Yae Miko, so there is a lot of flexibility here. With that said, you can also run the 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate to increase your elemental burst damage based on how much ER you're building, and in some team comps, as we'll see in the next section, you may need a lot of energy recharge, and since your elemental burst does do a lot of damage, this 4-piece set increasing your burst damage based on how much energy recharge you have, combined with the 2-piece effect giving you 20 ER, is actually pretty relevant. If that wasn't enough, the 4-piece Thundering Fury, while I don't recommend it on Yae Miko per se, it is technically viable because you do gain Aggravate and Hyperbloom damage bonus, so it is pretty good, but typically 2-piece Thundering Fury with another 2-piece, or the other sets like Gilded Dreams if you are proccing those reactions, will be better. Lastly, I did want to point out that technically 4 Millith has good uptime with Yae Miko's skill. I just don't personally recommend it as you lose a lot of your Yae Miko's personal damage, but it is viable if all you care about is your team's DPS and aren't investing that much into your Yae. Generally speaking though, to give you guys a conclusion that isn't confusing, Gilded Dreams is going to be your new best in slot for Dendro based teams, but it is pretty comparable to other sets that I mentioned earlier, so go based on your substats. However, if you don't want to run Dendro Reactions and want to run Yae in, for example, just a Raiden Yae team or use her as a generic Electro support, then I would recommend going for other sets like mix and matching 2-pieces or going for the 4-piece Emblem or 4-piece Thunder Soother. Alright, now moving on, what artifact stats you actually want on Yae Miko? Well, you know that Elemental Mastery, Energy Recharge, and then offensive stats like attack, damage bonus, and crit are all good for your Miko. Which ones are going to be your priority? Well, first of all, you need to determine how often you're going to be using your burst. While I personally really like using Yae Miko's burst, and it is a good amount of damage, if you can't have it up all the time, or you only plan on using it once every 2 rotations, then that can decrease how much energy recharge you need, which is something that is highly variable and also depends on your team comp. Now, generally speaking, that is around 140 to 160%, but it can go up to 100 180. If you don't have a good source of energy generation on your team, the exact numbers always vary, so test out what works for you and your team comp, but 140 to 160 is a good general range to go for. Now, with the ER amount out of the way, let's talk about what stats you want on your main stats, what offensive stats you're looking for. Generally speaking, for your sands and substats in general, while Elemental Mastery is good and a viable option if you have better pieces for Elemental Mastery, attack percent is typically going to be better than Elemental Mastery for Yae Miko, but not always. When you are using your Yae Miko for her own damage in, say, a Quicken team, where you're constantly applying Quicken to enemies and proccing Aggravate, or in a standard non-Dendro team for Yae Miko, attack percent will be the better option than Elemental Mastery, with Elemental Mastery still being viable in a Quicken team if you have much better substats on your sands. Generally though, in those teams, I would recommend going for an attack sands, and then going for an electro damage bonus goblet, and then either crit rate or crit damage on the circlet. Now, while the exact breakpoints of how much Elemental Mastery you want do depend, I do want to say that generally speaking, roughly the first 150 Elemental Mastery for your Yae Miko can be more important than your attack percent, so trying to achieve that on your substats. But if you don't have a lot on your substats, then Elemental Mastery can be better or about as good based on your substats. Do keep in mind though, for Quicken / Aggravate teams specifically, going for crit, rate, and damage is very important, as that buffs not only your Yae's damage, but also the reaction damage as well, the damage of your Aggravate. So crit is going to be very important to try to focus on. Where it does change though is in a Hyperbloom team, where your Yae Miko is going to be your electro character proccing Hyperbloom, which is a transformative reaction that's damage scales on your Elemental Mastery and your level. Because of that, not only is it important to level your Yae Miko to 90, but it's also very important to have as much Elemental Mastery as possible for that reaction. Now, while in practice, it is still generally better in a Hyperbloom team to go for a more hybrid build where you are maximizing your Yae's personal damage and your Hyperbloom reaction damage instead of just stacking Elemental Mastery. Both builds can be viable. What I mean by that is, in a Hyperbloom team, you typically want Elemental Mastery on your sands, and then for your Goblet and Circlet, generally speaking, electro damage bonus and crit will be higher DPS, at least from the testing and calcs that we've done. However, going for full Elemental Mastery can still be a viable option if you have better substats on those pieces, so it is a viable option for your Circlet and Goblet. Because of that, the way you build Yae Miko does depend on your playstyle, and I hope I did a decent job at explaining that. But to recap in general terms, for most builds, going either attack or Elemental Mastery on the sands, or energy recharge being viable if you need it and don't have enough in your substats, is going to be the way to go, and then you usually go electro damage Goblet and crit on the Circlet for an optimal Yae build. For Hyperbloom, while this is still typically optimal, with the only exception being to focus on an Elemental Mastery sands instead of attack, going for Elemental Mastery on your Goblet and Circlet as well can be viable, but it's typically not as good and not as recommended. But do go based on your substats, as that is very important. I hope I did a good job at explaining that without making it too confusing, because again, Yae Miko's damage is split amongst her kit and her reactions, so finding a balance between both of those is going to be crucial for Yae Miko, with crit stats typically being your main focus on substats, but attack and Elemental Mastery and obviously energy recharge, if you need it, also being very good. Next up, let's talk about Yae Miko's weapons and which ones I believe you should use on her. Now, I want to start by saying that Yae Miko is a very flexible Catalyst character in the sense that she really wants offensive stats like crit and can use attack, Elemental Mastery, and even energy recharge as well, which means that most Catalysts are honestly pretty good options for her. With that said, there are some that are better than others, which is what I'm going to clarify in this section. In fact, pretty much every single 5-star Catalyst is really good for her, so if you have them, you can use them. First of all, the Kagura's Verity, which is her signature weapon, is usually just the best for her because it gives you so many stats like crit damage on the main stat, and then a really good effect that will increase your skill damage and also your elemental damage when you are casting your skill, which is obviously something that Yae Miko needs to do. And so because of that, while it isn't necessary to pull for this weapon, if you do have it or choose to pull for it, I would definitely recommend using it on your Yae Miko, as it is very good for her and usually her best in slot. Other than just that though, the new 5-star Catalyst, 1000 Floating Dreams, as well as Lost Prayers and Skyward Atlas are all about as good on Yae Miko. They're all very good for her if you can make use of the stats. So for example, for 1000 Floating Dreams, that's assuming you're proccing reactions and can make use of the Elemental Mastery, whereas with the others, it's just attack or crit, which are all really good for your Yae. Generally speaking, these 4 5-star options are your best ones, but there are some 4-stars that are not far behind. And I also wanted to mention, while we're talking about 5-stars, that the Memory of Dust is viable for her and pretty good, but not quite as good as the other 5-stars, and it can also even be worse than some of the best 4-stars that we're about to talk about, notably the Solar Pearl and the Widsith. In fact, Solar Pearl and Widsith are generally going to be the go-tos for Yae Miko, alongside the Oathsworn Eye, assuming you got it from the event, but there are basically situations where all of these are better, and there is a few things that I need to explain. Starting things off, I am a big fan of Widsith in general because it gives you so much crit damage, and then in effect, it'll give you a huge amount of stats for one rotation for 10 seconds out of 30, which makes it exceptionally good for short fights or if you can clear fast, as this 10-second buff is going to be extremely relevant given how much attack, elemental damage, or or elemental mastery it does give you. All three of these are really good for Yae, especially the first two, but again, it is better for shorter fights, and it does require you to play around the 10-second buff, as if not, it's not as valuable. Moving on, the Solar Pearl is also really good. Both of these catalysts are extremely good overall, one giving you crit rate, the other giving you crit damage. Solar Pearl is a bit more consistent in the sense that it buffs your skill and burst damage when you normal attack, and buffs your normal attack when your skill or burst hits opponents. Because of that, I would recommend using your normal attacks when you swap into Yae Miko, at least one, to make sure you are proccing the effect and buffing your skill and burst damage. Like the Widsith, these weapons do get a lot better with refinement, but even at R1, they are very good. Lastly, the Oathsworn Eye was available as a free-to-play option in the event during Yae Miko's first banner, so if you have it, it is a really good weapon at R5, comparable to the other 4-stars that I mentioned, if you can make use of the good amount of energy recharge it gives you on the effect at R5. Because of that, those are going to be the 3 go-to 4-star options alongside the 5-stars that I mentioned, so you can pick whichever one you have, or whichever one suits your needs, like if you need more crit rate or more crit damage. Before getting into an exact weapon ranking though, I want to quickly mention the other weapons that I didn't talk about, notably the Wandering Evenstar, which can help buff your team. Mapamare, with the elemental damage it gives you and the EM, can be a good free-to-play option, especially in a Dendro team where you can make use of the elemental mastery. Lastly, I wanted to mention that the Hakushin Ring and the Blackcliff Agate can be viable, but for the Hakushin Ring, you need to actually run your Yae Miko on field or spend more time for her on field to make use of the passive, and for Blackcliff Agate, it is a decent option if you don't have better, but generally speaking, weapons like the Widsith or Solar Pearl, if you have them, or anything else I mentioned, I would much prefer over, so I wouldn't really spend my Star Glitter on that weapon. With that said though, I want to get into an exact weapon ranking, but do keep in mind that this does highly depend on the team you're playing and how you gearing your Yae Miko. So I'll put the weapon ranking on screen now, and this is one for a Quicken Yae team, a pretty standard Yae team where you're going to be proccing Quicken and Aggravate, and she's going to be doing a significant part of your team's overall DPS. Do keep in mind that if you plan on running Hyperbloom instead, while the weapon ranking is honestly similar because she still wants the same stats, Elemental Mastery does become a bit more valuable, so keep that in mind. EM weapons can be a bit better, and if you plan on running her without Quicken in a non-Dendro team, there is a weapon ranking on that from my last video that I can show briefly now as well, in case you're wondering, but since this is an updated Yae guide and we're focused on her new teams, which in my opinion are just a lot better, and she really does shine in Dendro teams, this is the main weapon ranking that I want to focus on, but obviously just use it as a general ranking, as the exact ranking varies heavily based on your stats, teams, and rotations. Alright, now very quickly, I wanted to include a small but important section regarding Yae's rotations and some tips that I could give you. First of all, when you're using Yae Miko, you want to either be using your burst every rotation or every other rotation, depending on how much energy recharge you have and what playstyle you choose to go for. Generally speaking, while I'm a big advocate for Yae's burst, there are pros and cons for both, especially when it comes down to how much energy recharge you're actually going to need. Now, with that said, the way you should be playing Yae Miko, regardless of how often you use your burst, is by setting up your elemental skill, using your skill 3 times on Yae Miko, and then swapping out to your other characters, using all their abilities, setting everything up, and then going back to Yae Miko, using her burst, and then using her skill 3 more times. The reason why I would recommend doing this instead of just using Yae Miko's skills, then her burst, and then her skills again, are because number one, that takes a ton of time, and during that time, you won't really have much else going on, especially if you start with Yae Miko, but also, and especially, this is the most efficient way to have all of your characters do good damage while also being able to, for example, buff your electro damage with an Anemo support or by using Dendro Reactions. Because of that, you can cycle through all of your other characters, use all of their abilities, and get everything ready for you to then go back into Yae Miko, use your burst, which will deal really good electro damage, and then allow you to use your skill another 3 times so that you always have that passive electro damage from your Yae Miko. Also, a bonus tip that I wanted to mention is when you are on Yae and you do swap into her, even if you plan on running her from off field, it can sometimes be worth using a normal attack just when you're on her, like in between your skill cast. So for example, normal attack and then skill, so you can kind of cancel it into it. And the reason why you might want to do that is if you're running off-field supports like Beta or Xingqiu, who do damage when you do normal attack, like on your hits with Yae Miko, or if you run a weapon like the Solar Pearl, that will give you buffs when you use a normal attack. And the very last thing I wanted to add is that keep in mind that Yae Miko can be quite vulnerable at times, which is why some people feel that her playstyle is a bit clunky because of how many times you have to use your skill, and during that period you're obviously not invulnerable, so you can get hit, and Yae Miko is a pretty fragile character. So be wary of how you play her, be sure to dodge between your skill casts or use your skill when you're not getting hit, and then either swap or use your burst, but just do be mindful of when you are casting your skill, as using an ability 3 times in a row obviously can leave you vulnerable. Alright, now moving on, let's talk about Yae Miko's constellations and how good I believe they are. Now, I will say, while Yae Miko doesn't need constellations, she does have some pretty good early ones that I do specifically want to talk about. First of all, Yae Miko's first constellation can greatly decrease how much energy recharge she needs and allow you to sometimes even not need any at all or very little, especially when paired with other electro characters like Raiden Shogun specifically, who will already restore energy to your Yae, and when paired with this constellation can really allow you to focus on offensive stats and not need that much energy recharge. But But even just in general though, this constellation is quite good, as what it does is give you 8 elemental energy every single time you destroy an elemental pillar with your burst, which means that in practice, when you use your burst, you'll just gain 24 energy back, which just makes this constellation quite good for getting free energy on your Yae Miko. Moving on, your second constellation will also be a pretty good damage increase, as it increases the range of your elemental skill and increases their level, or their max level rather, from 3 to 4. Because of that, there's just going to be a strict DPS increase to your elemental skill and also increasing their attack range, which is quite nice and a pretty significant DPS increase of around 15%. Moving on, C3 and 5 increase your talent level, but C3 is a pretty nice one as it increases your skills level, which is her main source of damage. Yae Miko's fourth constellation increases the electro damage bonus of all of your party members when your skill hits an opponent, which means it has good uptime and will just be a nice amount of electro damage bonus, especially relevant in electro teams with either Raiden Shogun or in just Aggravate / Quicken teams in general, where you tend to run more than one electro character. Lastly, Yae Miko's sixth constellation makes your elemental skill ignore 60% of the opponent's defense, which is really good, but does only affect your elemental skill damage. Now, while that is the main source of your damage and it is nice, I don't value this constellation as much as some other C6s because it is quite similar to like Raiden Shogun's second constellation, which obviously isn't as expensive as a sixth one and isn't comparable in my opinion to like Nahida's C6 or Yelan C6, but it is still a pretty big DPS increase for your Yae Miko's personal damage, so it is nice, but obviously not needed. With that said, Yae Miko is perfectly good at C0, but her first constellation and her second one, in my opinion, are pretty decent value if you do want to get them. Alright, now moving on, I want to talk about one of the most important sections in this video, which is going to be regarding Yae Miko's teams. As I mentioned earlier, Yae Miko has a lot of different ways to be played, either with or without Dendro, and on or off field. So let's start with Dendro, and I'm going to break down a generic formula for how you're going to be building a Dendro Yae team, giving you the formula and specifying the best options in every slot. Starting things off, for a generic Quicken team, you're going to be pairing Yae Miko with another Dendro option, another Electro option, and then a flex slot at the end. For your Dendro option, Nahida is going to be the best character right now for a Dendro support who just is really good at dealing damage and applying Dendro. But if you don't have her, don't worry. For an off-field option, you can use the main character who is definitely good enough. And if you want someone a bit more on-field, Sifnari can work as well, but it does change your playstyle as you do have to play around his field time and his charge shots. Moving on, your next slot is going to be an Electro option. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can do this. If you want to run Yae Miko as just a generic support, Electro support in these teams, you can run an on-field carry as the other Electro option. It can be Kaching or Sino, and then have Yae Miko just being a passive off-field support will deal pretty good aggravate damage and apply a decent amount of Electro. Now, if you're not choosing to pair Yae Miko with an Electro main DPS, you can run a ton of different flex Electro options that can work very well in a team like this. These options can be someone like Kuki if you want a 2-in-1 healer, but also pretty good Electro application and Electro damage in a Dendro-based team, so Kuki can work very well. Or you can run just a straight-up damage dealer like Fischl, Beidou, or even Lisa can work in these teams as just a way to get passive Electro damage and also some Electro energy for your Yae Miko. Because of that, it is really a flexible slot. Any just Electro damage dealer that can be ran from off-field can work very well alongside your Yae Miko. Do keep in mind that in these teams though, Yae Miko is going to have a more on-field role, at least filling in the downtime of your rotation by doing some normal attacks that will apply Electro, proc aggravate, and also enable supports like Beidou or Fischl to really just deal good damage from off-field. In a team like this, your last slot is going to be very flexible. If you already have a healer or don't need one, then you can go for an offensive option like Kazuha or Sucrose, who can swirl Electro, buff your elemental damage, and just be a really good addition to your team. I do like running Kuki in a team like this, but you don't need to. You can run more offensive Electro options like I mentioned earlier, which will then usually make you run a more defensive flex slot at the end, like either Zhongli for resistance shred and a shield, or Jean for an Anemo swirler who also heals you. With that said, if you don't need a healer, you can still run an offensive option, but that's typically not recommended for most players. If that wasn't enough, your last slot can even be a Hydro character, notably a Hydro healer like Kokomi, or a more offensive Hydro option, but we'll get into that a bit later. The reason for this is because you can proc Hyperbloom alongside your other reactions like Quicken, and effectively play a Quickbloom team if your Hydro application isn't too fast with someone like Kokomi or Barbara. In fact, since you're applying a bunch of Dendro and a bunch of Electro, constantly proccing Quicken, Aggravate, and sometimes Spread, having a bit of Hydro being applied can give you bonus Hyperbloom damage, assuming you have someone who can proc those Hyperblooms, being either an on-field Yae Miko or an off-field Kuki. Because of that, teams like this work very well and allow you to still maintain that quick Quicken aura and proc powerful reactions. Now, if you choose to run a faster Hydro applier, this will no longer really be a Quickbloom team. It'll be more so of a Hyperbloom team, which means you're applying so much Hydro that you're removing the Quicken aura, still getting some aggravates, but not as many, which means you'll have less electro damage, but more Hyperbloom damage. But Hyperbloom with Nahida in general is really good. And while Yae Miko isn't necessarily the best option for Hyperbloom with Nahida, as you can run Kuki from off field and then run Ayato or things like that, she can work in a team like this, and I do genuinely like it. Running Yae Miko with another electro option and then a fast Hydro applier like Xingqiu or Yelan can actually work and make a pretty decent Hyperbloom team. But do keep in mind you want to be running Yae Miko on field in this team to reliably proc Hyperblooms, as if not, she won't be able to, unless you're also running a character like Kuki who can Hyperbloom from off field. Overall though, in Dendro teams, there's a lot of options: Hyperbloom, Quickbloom, or just Quicken, where you can run her either on field as an auto attacker or off field alongside an electro carry. Because of that, I really do like Yae Miko in Dendro teams and think she does have a pretty strong niche as being another electro option you can run who can apply pretty consistent electro and deal pretty good damage, especially with the Aggravate reaction. As I mentioned in my last video, I don't recommend running Yae Miko off field in a Hyperbloom team. Like, if you run her in this team instead of Kuki, the Hyperbloom is not going to be consistent because of the way her skill targets enemies and won't hit all the Dendro cores. So I don't recommend her as an off-field Hyperbloom option as much as I would recommend her for an on-field in either a Quickbloom or just a generic Hyperbloom team comp. Moving on, for non-Dendro options, it's very straightforward. You can either run her with the Raiden Shogun in a Raiden Hypercarry team or in just any team where you need an Electro support. You can also run her in Electro Charge Taser teams, and she can be the on-field auto attacker here instead of someone like Sucrose or Kokomi. She can be an on-field auto attacker applying Electro and allowing your Beidou and Xingqiu's bursts to proc on her normal attacks. You can also run her in a mono Electro team paired up with someone like Raiden and then either Sara or just another Electro support, and she can work quite well there. And so because of that, she is very flexible in her teams, but I do think that Dendro and Aggravate specifically are really where she shines the most and really where she gets the most value. Because of that, these are the teams I recommend primarily, as well as what I'm going to be showing off in the showcase section of this video, which is coming up next.
But it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light shine through. If you believe it's true, baby, won't you let the light shine through? For you, for you, for you, for you, for you,
right here, right now, a sight to behold. Emerge right now.
And so yeah, that's about it. Overall, as you saw, Yae Miko is a character that I really like, especially with the Dendro reactions that have greatly buffed her. Now, I do apologize if this video is a bit long. I really went into great detail, as I feel like Yae Miko is a character with quite a bit of depth and different ways to be played, so I believe she deserved it. With that said, I will try to keep my future guides a bit shorter, but do leave your feedback and questions in the comments down below, as I will be going through them. With that said, I really hope this guide was helpful. I really hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.